Thank you for joining us. My name is Sean Donahue. I am the VP of Marketing here at Miro Consulting. Joining me today for our presentation is Tim Hegedus, Senior Managing Analyst, also here at Miro Consulting, specialist in our Microsoft practice. Today's webinar will be on Windows Server 2016 licensing changes. Very exciting things happening in the Microsoft world. And very complex things happening with the way Microsoft is changing its licensing around servers, including virtualization and per-core servers. Starting off today will be Tim Hegedus, and he will start the presentation. Tim, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Sean, and welcome.
All right, we'll be beginning the presentation now. We had a brief issue with some sound. That's all cleared up. Tim, would you like to start us off in the presentation?
Okay, well, welcome everyone, and thank you for taking some time to join us here today. It's a particularly important topic as we work on Windows Server 2016 licensing and how that impacts you going down the road. A little bit about Miro Consulting. We have been software licensing advisors since September of 2000, and we've been around for a little while. And during that time, we have serviced well over 800 clients across the globe. This includes over 50% of the Fortune 500 companies and the 25% of the Fortune 100 companies. Now, personally, I've been around for a little while, too. I've been here at Miro for about 10 years. In the 2+ decades ahead of that, I've held various positions in system administration and database administration, all the way to running a multi-geography, multi-data center environment for a very, very large payments customer. So as our last bit of housekeeping, I would say that we will be entertaining some questions for you towards the end of our presentation today. So please type your question in the message box, and we will answer those for you as much as we can, as much as time allows. So we think that it's pretty important that you keep in mind these major points as we travel through this idea around Windows 2016 server licensing. This move to Windows Server 2016 might and will very likely incur some additional costs for you and your company in the shorter term as well as in the longer term. Secondly, if you are in the midst of planning a hardware upgrade, the information we present will be very, very important to that effort. And even if the start of this planning is months off, the positioning for Windows 2016 should be taken into account. And then finally, your plans for using some of the new features and functionality of Windows Server 2016, either now or in the future, informs your decisions on the service branch, the different service branches that Microsoft offers. So the overriding question is, how will these changes affect your upgrade planning? With the points we've elaborated in mind, we're going to embark on this journey, and we're going to try to offer a little bit more than what Microsoft documentation offers. And hopefully we'll be successful in answering any questions that you have. And nevertheless, we encourage you not only to ask questions today, but to follow up with us later on during the course of our proceedings here today. So let's take a look at some of the risks and some of the challenges associated with Windows Server 2016. As is often very necessary, we need to take a brief step back in order to understand the future. So let's go back, way back to 2008. And if you're still running this particular legacy version of Windows Server, I hope you are aware the support window is starting to run really short. As you can see from the slide, Windows Server 2008 and 2008 R2 are already in extended support, which means that neither can be certified with any products, that being Microsoft's or any others, nor will any enhancements to these products be entertained by Microsoft. It also means that complementary support vanishes, and so that requires that a Premier Support Agreement, a contract for Premier Support, be written. And as you can also see, in just about a year, Windows Server 2012 and 2012 R2 enter their extended support phase. So unless you're running 2016 at that point, you're going to be running a very clearly down-level version of Windows Server 2016. Now, we won't linger on this topic, but we are now beginning to see how Microsoft's increased release velocity is starting to impact its customers. With these new versions being released every other year or so, it impacts the support life cycle and therefore your support schedule. Again, a topic for another day. Now, throwing hardware at it is still in many ways the approach for many performance problems. But since 2008, when Microsoft really expanded its hardware contingent licensing commitments, that is, in the per processor and per core metrics, that approach translates into not only additional hardware costs, but also additional software costs. But we have to wonder whether that's required, whether that's a must. And we have to think that two considerations are in play here. First, all the computing capacity in the world and all the core density in the world won't help applications that are I/O bound. That's a storage issue, or that's a networking issue, and the fastest processors on the planet simply cannot process data that hasn't reached them yet. Second, those applications that are compute heavy, that are processor centric, might benefit from faster processor speeds, not necessarily more cores. So that's an idea that is worth benchmarking within your environment. And then lastly, Microsoft will make you whole for per core licenses through its grant program. Now, for those of you who might have lived through the switch of SQL Server from per processor to per core, way back for version 2012, it's essentially the same thing, and it requires that you reveal some information to Microsoft. And that can be a little bit unsettling if you are uncertain about your license position. So something of an internal health check might be in order before you find yourself on the business end of a Microsoft audit. So let's see what all this is about, right? Right off the bat, we have to talk about minimums. Yes, that is minimums, right? Something new. And here's how this plays out, right? The licensing requirement is the largest of these. All physical cores in the server, that means that the servers are licensed by the number of processor cores in the physical server. Okay, that's number one. Number two, you must have a minimum of 16 core per server. And lastly, you must have a minimum of 8 cores per physical processor. Okay, so right off the bat, we have this new minimum. Now, earlier we started to talk about this grant program. Okay, and I want to stay on this just a little bit because there are some nuances to this. Microsoft is going to provide no-cost licenses during this transition period, which essentially is until your software assurance term expires. Right? But no cost doesn't mean free. And so let me explain that. In circumstances where you receive more than the standard amount, that is 8 cores per processor, you will have to pay the additional software assurance fees. So that should mean 2 things to you. One, only the licenses with active software assurance are eligible for the program. Okay. Secondly, you must continue software assurance on the grants because there is no license. In other words, if you were to look at your Microsoft license statement or your MLS, it won't show any licenses. Instead, it will show that there is active software assurance on licenses that don't exist. Okay, so if and when you opt to discontinue software assurance, those grants now disappear, right? So something to remember in 2 or 3 years when you're renewing your EA or renewing software assurance on SQL Server or Windows Server. And the last part of this switch from per processor to per core is that virtualization is impacted. Now, you might recall that under versions 2012 and 2012 R2, which were licensed in the per processor metric, you could still support a fairly generous amount of virtual instances by stacking licenses of Windows Server Standard. Right? Now, each license of Windows Server Standard allowed for up to 2 virtual instances. So that means that a quad processor would allow for up to 4 virtual instances. And if a 5th or a 6th one was necessary, all that was needed was to allocate or stack another license on that same physical host. And that stacking activity allowed for the additional virtual instances. And you could do that up to a factor of 7. Or another way of saying this is that Windows Server Data Center costs 7 times what Windows Server Standard cost. So the server we're talking about here, this quad core, right, could have up to 14 licenses, right, which would allow for up to 28 virtual instances. And that would cost roughly the same as just 2 licenses of Windows Server Data Center. And, you know, just on a side note, I have to kind of put out there, I have to ask you, can a quad-core server actually support 28 virtual instances? You know, that remains to be seen. Well, that's changed now with the release of Windows Server 2016 and the per-core metric. Now, all the physical cores in the server must be licensed again in order to qualify for just 2 additional virtual instances. So in this particular case, let's say that you have 16 virtual cores, right, or 16 physical cores. You have to license them all to get 2 virtual instances. If you want to get 2 more, you have to license those 16 cores again. Okay, now this kind of works out because the pricing ratio has remained the same. But going forward, we're not so sure, and we certainly wouldn't be surprised if Microsoft changes those price points and not in a very favorable way for us. So it's very clear that Microsoft has made its case for Windows Server Data Center being the go-to for medium to heavily virtualized environments. So there are some additional considerations, okay? And I think these all impact any planning that you have with regard to moving to Windows Server 2016. Now, first and foremost, when Microsoft released version 2012 of Windows Server, they somewhat proudly proclaimed that the primary editions, Standard and Data Center, were technologically equivalent. In fact, the only difference between the two was their virtualization rules. Well, you know, what's old is new again. And so version 2016 has reintroduced technological differences. Data Center Edition, and only Data Center Edition, includes things like storage spaces direct, storage replica, shielded virtual machines, and the networking stack. Now, note that Nano Server, a very, very important component and feature of Windows Server 2016, is available under both editions. However, in order to deploy Nano Server, you must have active software assurance. Okay? Now, this is a requirement that is in addition to other requirements for software assurance. So none of those old requirements went away. This introduces another one. And now this in turn, right, Nano Server and software assurance also impacts the service model. Okay? And there's some complexity here, so I'm gonna go pretty slowly, right? And it centers on Nano Server, which not only requires active software assurance, but it also mandates a branch called the Current Branch for Business, or CBB service model, right? If you go with Nano Server, you have to choose that service model, and that translates into what Microsoft refers to as cloud cadence, right? Now, cloud cadence is very, very bleeding edge. Microsoft is going to introduce 2 or 3 updates every year. But more importantly for us, Microsoft will only offer security updates and bug fixes for the 2 most recent updates. Right? So if they're releasing 2 a year, it's only in that year that they're providing that level of support. So that means that you have to consider and schedule and allot time and resources for an annual update of Windows 2016. Okay? And a year is probably your minimum. It might even actually be more than that. Perhaps every 8 or 9 months you'll have to upgrade Windows Server 2016 if you opt to use the Nano Server. Now, the other option is without Nano Server, right? And it's called, and some of you may be familiar with this, something called LTSB, or the Long-Term Service Branch. It's what we're more used to, something that we're more familiar with. It features 5 years of mainstream support, followed by 5 years of extended support. So that is pretty standard. A software assurance, by the way, is not required for LTSB, but without software assurance, you could never use that instance of Windows Server 2016 for Nano Server. Okay.
And this is just to remind our audience, if you have any questions on what we've gone over so far, please use the question box located in your GoToWebinar control panel.
Right. So some things to leave you with, right? And I realize that we've given you a lot of information and a lot of thinking points in a very, very short period of time. But there are some takeaways, right? First and foremost is this new wrinkle that is introduced for software assurance with the Current Branch for Business, or CBB, for Nano Server. right? So that means for us that we have to take a very focused approach on what we decide is covered by software assurance. And this just adds more to the process and more to the discussion, right? Beyond externally accessed applications and disaster recovery and other aspects, right? We also suggest that because of the transition from per processor to per core, the licensing of Windows Server 2016 requires a more deliberate, more thorough thinking through of hardware purchases. And even if that upgrade to Windows Server 2016 is not planned for months or potentially even years, if the hardware purchased today is what will be supporting it, we advise that some very careful debate needs to ensue to determine what hardware best suits each application. Right? Now, in order to avoid painting yourself into a corner around the idea of stacking Windows Server standard licenses, especially if you do not have software assurance on them, and which precludes any kind of step-up licensing, right? We urge you to exercise a lot of caution here. While the 7-to-1 ratio that we explained before still applies today, we're not sure where Microsoft is going to take this in the future, right? So in addition, we don't really have a clear picture of what future virtualization rules might come to pass, right? And so for all these reasons, a very heavy concentration on how your clusters are configured is essential to your license planning. And along those same lines, right, it would be a fruitful exercise, we believe, to understand the current and future use of licenses, right? We would incorporate legacy applications, user access, support life cycle, and much, much more, right? And a critical part of that exercise is to include an independent Microsoft licensing expert because, well, let's face it, right? Many technical decisions are based on the investment that is associated with them, right? So maximizing the utility of your license estate, or in other words, maximizing the performance of your Microsoft investment while reining in its costs is the optimal solution here, but it's not unachievable. In fact, we consider it to be very, very achievable. So we encourage you to start to look at your environment with a more critical eye. Consider what Microsoft's Windows Server 2016 does for you in terms of software assurance investment, hardware investment, and so on. And then if you still have questions, reach out to your LSP or reach out to a Miro and ask those types of questions, and we'll be happy to answer them for you.
All right, great. Thank you very much, Tim. We're going to get to our questions at this point in the presentation. Again, if you have any questions, please use the question box in the GoToWebinar control panel. So our first question is, Tim, is there such a thing as licensing by virtual cores?
Well, the short answer is no, right? Licensing for Windows Server, unlike licensing for SQL Server, is only for physical cores. Each license covers up to 2, and a license can't be split among multiple processors or multiple servers. So no, only physical.
All right. Our next question is, can I upgrade to Windows Server 2016 without converting to the per core metric?
Yes, absolutely. Now that it's been released, customers with active software assurance can upgrade to Windows Server 2016 anytime they want. And they do not have to be concerned about any sort of license transition. So when the Microsoft software assurance term comes due, that's when the transition will take place, right? And that happens either at the end of your current enterprise agreement or at the end of your software assurance term under the MPSA.
All right. Our next question is, when do we start paying for the software assurance associated with the additional licenses granted under the program?
Microsoft's not going to ask you to make any additional payments until the renewal of your software assurance term. So if you're a year away or so from your EA renewal, you have up until then to switch over to the per core.
All right, we have one more question from the audience. All right. If I have a cluster of 5 physical machines with 20 physical cores on those machines, do I need a license for all 100 physical cores on the cluster?
Yeah, the answer is yes. That would be 50 licenses, right, because you have 100 cores. So 50 licenses, 52 packs would be required for that cluster, yes.
All right, great question. And then I believe we have one more question here. Okay. If we just renewed our enterprise agreement last summer, do we true up with processors or cores?
Oh, okay. Great question, as a matter of fact. If your enterprise agreement commenced prior to the GA of Windows Server 2016, which was October 1st, 2016, then you would continue to true up with processors, right? And then once you reach the renewal for that EA, you would go through the transition to per cores. If you've just started an EA, like this past November or December or just now, today maybe, any sorts of true ups that you do going forward would be under the per core metric.
All right. I think that's all the questions we have. Thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. We'll follow up with an email to everyone with the answers to the questions so that you can review. And again, if you have any further questions, please contact us at info@miroconsulting.com. That's info@miroconsulting.com. Thank you very much.